Today we're exploring the linen stitch by transforming a one-sided stitch pattern into a truly reversible version, which looks similar to the right side of the original on both sides. First, we'll make the transformation to a reversible version. I'll give 3 tips on how to read your knitting, as it's a bit tricky, and then we'll explore the reversibleness of the stitch pattern. At the end, we'll look at project considerations like the cast-on, selvage, and especially the gauge to maximize your project success, and I'll show you a close-up look at the scarf I'm working on using this stitch pattern. If you're new to knitting, check out my Learn to Knit, the ABCs in Cotton series for the basics. They're linked in the description below. The reversible linen stitch is related by row pattern to the small coaster project and by stitch technique to the large placemat project. So let's knit. I've already worked 2 rows in pattern so it's easier to see and slipped the selvage. The original linen stitch is a 2-stitch 2-row repeat. Row A is a knit-based row and is worked knit 1, slip purlwise with yarn in front. One more time, knit 1, slip purlwise with yarn in front. You can see that the slip stitch is a knit-looking stitch on this side and that the working yarn creates a bar across the front of the slip stitch. Row B is a purl-based row and is worked purl 1, slip 1 purlwise with yarn in back. One more time, purl 1, slip 1 purlwise with yarn in back. Now the slip stitch is a purl-looking stitch on this side and the working yarn creates a bar across the back of the slip stitch. After a few rows, you can clearly see the difference in the sides. I'll mark the side worked with row A as side A and the other is side B. You can see that the worked and the slipped stitches for both rows look the same. Here's side A, the right side of the work. Knit and purl stitches are the reverse of each other, and slipping a stitch with the yarn in front is the reverse of in the back. The key to reversibility here is the combination of the type of stitch, knit or purl, and the placement of the working yarn in front or behind the slip stitch. Slipping a knit stitch with yarn in front is the reverse of slipping a purl stitch with yarn in back. Using these symbols, side A looks like this, and side B looks like this. I tried many versions and combinations to transform the one-sided linen stitch to a reversible version. The one I like best is surprisingly simple. I'll show a brief progression of the stitch pattern evolution at the very end of the video. The reversible linen stitch is worked in a similar way as the one-sided version, but as a 4-row repeat. It can be a bit tricky to differentiate the rows, so I'll give you a few tips on how to work and read your knitting that I found helpful as we work through a few rows. For example, I've reordered the stitches because it makes it easier and it doesn't change the look or structure. Rows 1 and 2 are worked similar to row A of the original, so 2 passes of a knit-based row. Rows 3 and 4 are worked similar to row B of the original, so 2 passes of purl-based rows. The result is more sophisticated than it seems, so let's knit a few rows. The first tip is that, like the one-sided version, the working yarn alternates between the front and the back of the work. For the 2 knit-based rows, the stitches are slipped with yarn in front, and the knit stitches are worked as normal with yarn in back. For the 2 purl-based rows, the stitches are slipped with yarn in back, and the purl stitches are worked as normal with yarn in front. The second tip is that because the 2 sides are identical, it's important to know which side you're on. Rows 1 and 3 are worked on side A, which is marked. Rows 2 and 4 are worked on side B. This way you know if you're on the first or second pass of the knit or purl-based row. The third tip is to look at the first stitch on the needle after the selvage. If you're on side A and the first stitch is a knit-looking stitch, then you're on the first pass of a knit-based row, that is, row 1. When you turn, the knit stitch you just made on side A now looks like a purl on side B, and so it's time for pass 2 of the knit-based rows. Once you're back on side A, the last knit stitch from row 2 looks like a purl. So if the first stitch on side A is a purl, then you're on the first pass of a purl-based row, that is row 3. And on side B, if the first stitch is a knit, then work the second purl-based row, row 4. So on side A, match the first stitch, and on side B, do the reverse. This is the same as the basic stitch pattern from the ABCs in Cotton coaster project. It has a similar row structure. A quick note on the reversibleness before we look at project ideas. The one-sided linen stitch uses 2 slip stitch combinations. Slip a knit stitch with yarn in front, and slip a purl stitch with yarn in back. These combinations are the reverse of each other, as I mentioned. For the one-sided linen stitch, they are worked in consecutive rows, so on opposite sides, and so they look the same on side A. You can see them here on the swatch as knit-looking stitches with a horizontal bar across. This is what makes the distinctive linen stitch look. The reversible version has 2 passes of each row, so these 2 combinations end up worked on the same side, so they look like the reverse of each other on side A. Pass 2 of the reversible linen stitch ends up using the other 2 combinations as well, that is, slip a knit stitch with yarn in back and slip a purl stitch with yarn in front. These are also the reverse stitch of each other. You can see them on the swatch making 2 horizontal bars, one from the purl bump and one from the slipped stitch bar. This is what makes the distinctive reversible linen stitch look, and is a great example of the many sides of reversible stitch patterns. So, what kind of projects does the reversible linen stitch work best for? That's what we'll talk about next. As with most woven stitches, the linen stitch creates a firmer fabric that holds its shape with little drip, especially with a smaller gauge. This is why I chose the easier granite linen stitch variation for the ABCs in Cotton Placemat project. This is the opposite effect of the brioche stitch from a few videos ago. With a looser gauge, the linen stitch drapes more, and the stitch definition is actually nicer, so it also works for scarves that aren't fussy. Using the same yarn and the reversible linen stitch pattern, the left swatch is knit with a 3.5mm needle and the right swatch with a 5mm needle. And as with the placemat project, I like the look of the crochet cast-on with this stitch pattern rather than the more common long-tail cast-on. It matches nicely with the simple slipped selvage and pass-over cast-off. Check out the placemat project video for detailed instructions. One interesting cast-on detail is which row to start the pattern on. For this scarf project that I'm working on, I started directly on row 1. If you're familiar with double knitting, you may recognize that repeating row 1 for all the rows is actually double knitting. So as you can see in the swatch, the edge has the distinctive look of double knitting. It could give an interesting look for a runner if you extended the double knitting section before transitioning to the linen stitch. A few bonus tips. Because of the slipped stitches, there is less yarn length making up the fabric, and at the same time, the slipped stitches on the needle need to stretch higher. So if your knitting is too tight, it gets hard to work the stitches. Also be prepared that the slipped stitches make this stitch pattern relatively slow to work up, as 2 passes are required for each stitch to grow vertically. For the next video, I'll return to the Mobius theme. This time we'll explore the helical Mobius construction using the double-sided Mobius cast-on and see the fascinating way the fabric grows from the middle. So pick up your knitting and create something awesome. I'll do my best to respond to comments, and I'd love to hear about your favorite reversible knitting pattern. Also feel free to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more awesome reversible knitting. For those of you still here, the last few years I've been working hard to find simple ways to feel better, what I call my daily well-being practices. This is not medical advice, I'm just sharing what works for me. Today's well-being practice is about the benefits of walking. Yeah, we've heard it before, but really it can make a big difference physically and mentally, even if we only walk once a week. Of course, we're getting the general benefits of exercise, and if you walk outside, we're getting organic, varying movement, which is is good for improving natural muscle tone, agility, and balance. We're also getting out of the house. Hopefully, we're getting fresh air, which is good for the lungs and brain. We can work on posture, practice far viewing, which is good to strengthen our brains and eyes, and maybe even getting early morning light, if you're really keen, to reset our circadian rhythm and help us sleep. Walking is also a great way to connect with friends and watch the changing of the seasons. And then we can get back to knitting with a clear head. Happy walking and have an awesome day!